There's a feeling in the air that you can't get anywhere except in Calgary. I taste 1,000 yesterdays and I love the magic ways of Calgary. From the mountains close at hand, I can look across the land and see you touch the sky.
Touch the sky.
From the prairies glow to where the sunsets go, we're all good neighbors passing by.
The Alberta Advantage is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network. This independent, listener-supported podcast is possible thanks to listeners like you. If you think what we do is important, support us with a monthly donation at patreon.com/Alberta Advantage. We are also producing video content and a newsletter. Check out our live streams on twitch.tv and YouTube and sign up for our newsletter at albertaadvantage.substack.com. Hello and welcome to the Alberta Advantage. I am your host, Kate Jacobson, and joining Team Advantage today, we have Roberta.
Hello.
And Rory.
Greetings.
So you've probably noticed over the past year that your trips to the grocery store were getting more expensive. And you are correct to notice that because Canada's Food Price Report of 2022 calculated that grocery prices rose by almost 4% in 2021. These price changes were uneven across food groups, ranging from a 9.5% increase for meats to a 2.1% decrease for vegetables, but the overall trend was up. For 2022, the report estimated that grocery prices would rise from 5 to 7%, and this equals an extra $966 for a typical family of four. So you're looking at an increase of almost $1,000 a year for a typical family just in inflation from grocery prices. In general, prices seem to be up across the board. The United States reported that December 2021 consumer prices were up by 7.1% over a year ago. This is the fastest rate in nearly 4 decades. And the most recent report for Canada at the time of this recording was November 2021, where annualized consumer prices were up 4.7%. This is an 18-year high. Now, in Canada, it's probably even more damning than that 4.7% figure suggests because housing prices are not included in the price measure, and we all know what has been happening to the housing market. In November of 2021, at the same time this report was released, the average Canadian house price hit an all-time record of $721,000. Good God, that is obscene, which is an almost 20% increase over the previous year. Now, price increases or inflation are, generally speaking, a pretty normal part of the capitalist economy. And what inflation is, and what it kind of means, is that every year the same nominal amount of money buys slightly less than the year before. So that means if we assume grocery prices will inflate by 7% in 2022, the same amount of groceries you paid $100 for this January are going to cost $107 in January 2023. Generally speaking, for a lot of consumers, this sounds bad because the money you have is not going to be going as far. You, in that case, would be in agreement with Royal Bank of Canada CEO Dave Mackay, who has recently called on the Bank of Canada to implement, quote, rapid action this spring as a series of rate increases to address it. But like everything else in the hell society that we live in, the impacts of inflation are really unevenly distributed. And this episode is going to be an explainer, a bit of a primer on inflation, but we're also going to be aiming to politicize our concepts of inflation by exploring its history and also examining what inflation means for working people.
At its core, inflation is a measure of the average rise in prices over time. However, it's a lot more complex than just that, as inflation is not just about the absolute rise in prices, but the change of prices of individual goods relative to a variety of other factors. For the vast majority of us who work for a living, inflation appears in the context of what the prices of things we buy are relative to the wages we earn. If nominal prices increase by 5% and our nominal wages increase but also by 5%, in real terms, our purchasing power is the same. When we talk about how wages have stagnated for decades, what we mean is that wages increases have at best matched inflation. And inflation is not uniform. And some kinds of goods, like, for example, electronics, have had their prices fall in absolute and relative terms. So 40 years ago, you could not buy a smartphone for any price, whereas now they're relatively affordable for most people. But other goods, like say housing, have actually significantly outpaced annual inflation.
Inflation is a dynamic process with many interlocking causes and diffuse impacts on the overall economy. Some of the potential causes of inflation are, on the one hand, demand pull. So this is high levels of spending that drive up prices. In this case, inflation is usually high during an economic boom, as firms and consumers have lots of cash on hand. High government outlays, such as during a war, can also cause this kind of demand pull inflation. Another way that inflation can be caused is through a cost push form. So these are increases in production input costs, like raw material shortages. So an energy supply shock, for instance, would have ripple effects on aggregate prices. High labor costs can also contribute to inflation. Wage increases, particularly in a tight labor market, can be passed on to consumers. So companies basically take their higher costs and make them a consumer cost instead of their costs. High profits can also cause inflation. So if companies are rolling in cash, they're going to seek to invest it, which can compete with other spenders like, say, home buyers in real estate. Printing money might also cause inflation. So this increases the money supply by the central bank, and it can basically just increase the amount of money flowing through the system and cause prices to increase. There's even more causes than just these, and we have to point out that it's rarely just one of them at work. As we've talked about on the podcast before, the economy is a complicated process, and so many factors are playing into this, and yet we like to try and point to one or another, and we should emphasize that there's many factors at play in all of this. And as stated before, under normal conditions of capitalist growth, there's always some level of inflation. If you're always trying to grow the economy, of course, it's always going to be growing the inflation. And so government monetary policy aims to maintain the level of this inflation to make sure it's manageable, that's in big quotation marks, by the, quote, economy.
There are many different groups of people in society who can be negatively impacted by inflation. So this would include people on fixed incomes, so pensioners, welfare recipients, anyone who's dependent on a fixed income. AISH would be a great example here in Alberta, is going to feel inflation pain because their wages aren't moving at all, and inflation will be eating away at their wages. Workers who are unable to win wage increases that keep up with inflation will see their standards of living erode. Additionally, creditors who loan money at fixed interest rates, so interest rates that don't fluctuate at all during the lifetime of a loan, will experience declining real value of this loan over time, and the owners of financial assets will typically have their portfolios depreciate. So when we're looking at who is negatively impacted by inflation, we're looking at quite different groups of people in society. Pensioners and owners of financial assets are very different groups of people, as are people on welfare, workers, creditors. For an individual or a firm to benefit from inflation, it requires a situation where the things that they are buying are having lower price increases relatively to higher price increases for the things that they sell. So the things that an individual or firm might be buying would be, generally speaking, labor costs, the raw materials that would go into production. A good example of this would be if the price of oil shot up, but production costs, so that would be labor, the cost of equipment, were remaining relatively stable, oil companies would reap a windfall and increase profit while everyone else would eat inflation. Since we live in a society, technically, I guess, where, although we do live in whatever it is, where capital is immensely more politically powerful than labor, you can probably hazard a guess at this point in the episode at who has the most influence over setting inflation policy. And since the 1970s, the owners of financial assets have been really successful in convincing governments to use monetary policy to target inflation. So earlier I mentioned RBC CEO Dave Mackay. The reason that he's issuing these warnings about inflation is not because he's worried about your grocery bill. It's not because he's worried about the declining purchasing power of your wages. What he's worried about is talking about the return on investment for financial assets. And in fact, if you look closely into his comments, he's saying it's really all the fault of workers and of labor all along because, and I quote, "we've never really gone back as a society and reduced wages," end quote. It's probably worth pointing out here that Dave Mackay is the 20th highest paid CEO in Canada in 2020. He received $13.5 million in pay and bonuses at the same time that millions of Canadian workers were out of work because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it's important here to mention that wage growth, yes, as we said before, can be one of the causes of inflation, but the balance of class forces in the world we live in ensures that workers bear the brunt of any inflation-fighting efforts.
So these inflation-fighting efforts, for example, include keeping unemployment high enough that it slows wage growth and so doesn't impact inflation. This is known as the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which in the United States is usually pegged around 5 to 6%. Which is also well above what we would consider full employment, which would be somewhere below like 3%. Another example is cutting the welfare state, which has a twofold effect. First, because the lack of social supports forces people back to work at lower wages. And second, because government spending can also increase inflation. So this is why corporate Canada and its propagandists in the media have been so insistent that pandemic aid not go to workers. So the CERB was ended long ago, but the wage subsidy continues to flow. Arguably, such generous government spending as the wage subsidy contributes to inflation, but business is reaping the benefits, so that's not really what we hear about. However, what inflation fighting does not include is reducing housing prices, which would definitely reduce the amount of money that families are outlaying on their living expenses. But real estate is incredibly profitable for corporate Canada, and so the government is not really going to intervene to do anything about that. Another is consumer price inflation. Grocery store prices are up, but grocery store profits are even further up. And the final thing is ensuring wages keep up with inflation. When is the last time you got a 5% annual wage increase? Because that's how much the price of everything else went up. So yeah, and sure, this high rate of inflation, it sucks. But when the Bank of Canada announces it's raising interest rates to compensate, it's not for you or I.
So the way of fighting inflation that Rory has just described was a real founding moment for neoliberalism. And we're going to be talking about the period from the mid-1970s through to the early 1980s, which is very much kind of the birthplace of neoliberalism and when it began to really aggressively be implemented in the global north. It was also a period of unusually high inflation rates, much, much higher than what we're seeing now. And in this particular circumstance, it generated a quite unusual economic crisis called stagflation. And this is where economic growth stalled while inflation was just soaring. This is really unusual because normally inflation rates fall along with GDP growth rates. So normally if economic growth is stalling, you would expect inflation to be stalling or at a lower percentage point at the same time. Early neoliberals blamed this problem of stagflation on the full employment policies and welfare state expansion pursued by developed capitalist countries after the Second World War. Full employment policies, for those of you who aren't familiar, because we certainly don't live in countries that pursue them anymore, was the stated goal of governments across the global north after World War II to have full employment in their society. So the idea was that like everyone who wanted to work would be able to work. Now, due to living in a neoliberal society, we have what's called structural unemployment. So that's the idea that there's always going to be a certain amount of people who are unemployed, which is generally used as a way to discipline labor and keep wages down. In the mid-70s and the early 1980s, though, there was a very tight labor market, and there were, generally speaking, generous social benefits, which were forcing businesses to compete for workers, and this drove up wages. This was also a time at which organized labor was much more powerful and much more militant, so workers were able to strike and win for wage increases that would be absolutely unheard of today. These high wages were causing a quote-unquote profit squeeze in that they were growing faster than corporate profits, and these corporate profits were derived from selling to a mass consumer economy whose demand was undergirded by wages from full employment. So workers were undergirding the mass consumer economy by their wages being used to participate in buying the products that firms produced. And this was kind of the social contract that existed after the Second World War. There is, generally speaking, some truth to this particular formulation of the problem, but extremely extremely high oil prices after 1973, owing to the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, played a really important role as well in driving up inflation. And this is often really not talked about or glossed over by a lot of economists, particularly neoliberal economists.
So the solution to this inflation problem at the time, as advanced by economist Milton Friedman, sort of the, grandfather, evil doer, whatever, creator of neoliberalism, was to use monetary policy to try and target inflation. So specifically by trying to attack the power of labor. And this may sound familiar to you since we talk a lot about neoliberalism and we talk about how part of it is about undercutting the power of labor and the labor movement. So in these conditions of stagflation, workers use the structural power granted to them by low unemployment to strike for higher wages to keep up with inflation. Central banks raised interest rates, inducing recessions to spike unemployment were combined with governments reducing the institutional power of labor as a method of flatlining wage growth and its threat to profits, all under the guise of reducing inflation. In fact, governments used very interventionist tactics to deal with this supposed problem. The Trudeau senior government implemented wage and price controls in 1975, which largely meant that the federal government capped wage increases even if unionized workers had negotiated more. This caused a great deal of labor unrest in 1976, but the government at the time held firm.
And this wasn't just happening in Canada, this was also happening in other countries in the global north. So an example of that is that the government is holding its own workers to a 5% pay increase. There's a strike by workers at Ford in the United Kingdom in late 1978. It settled with a pay increase of 17%. And this leads to widespread industrial disputes during what is quite reactionarily called the Winter of Discontent, which is characterized by widespread strikes by private and later public sector trade unions, which were demanding pay increases greater than the limits that Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan and his Labour Party government had been imposing.
And these inflation fighting tactics in the 1970s also have really significant impacts on sort of the larger political economy of manufacturing in the developed North, particularly in North America, so that the origins of the Rust Belt and deindustrialization are in this because part of how fighting inflation and fighting wage growth was also just relocating manufacturing to other regions with cheaper wages, both in the United States and also overseas. So like this is kind of really where the origins of like globalization as we know it are located, because if wages are an important part of driving up inflation, one of the ways you can defeat that is not merely like suppressing strikes and capping wage increases, but just literally moving the job somewhere else where wages are much, much lower. And it's like very difficult for organized labor within the developed capitalist core to even be able to fight back. And this sort of like way to defeat inflation is like kind of like really the basis of like the sort of crisis of like the developed capitalist world that we have been living under for decades. And it all like rolls back to this.
One of the interesting things that is going on at this time is inflation is so high that workers' wages, generally speaking, are not keeping up with inflation, even when firms are offering what to a worker today would seem to be an incredibly generous wage increase. We're talking about workers rejecting pay increases in the double digits, workers rejecting pay increases of things like 16.5%. And this leads to very militant, very aggressive strikes. I'm thinking here particularly of the 1972 UK coal miners' strike and the 1974 UK coal miners' strike, the latter of which actually led to the government being forced to implement a 3-day week in which commercial users of electricity could only use 3 days of electricity a week. The television had to shut off at 10:30 p.m. at night because electricity generation was so restricted by the restriction in coal supply caused by industrial dispute. These two strikes were both marked by incredibly militant picketing tactics. 1972 was the birth of what people call the flying picket. So coal miners from different pits going and traveling to other places in order to picket other miners or other workers and convince them to join the strike. It also included the Battle of Salt Lake Gate, where over 100,000 workers fought with the police outside Salt Lake Coke Depot, outside of Birmingham, Birmingham, forcing the police to close Salt Lake Coke Depot. And the reason I'm bringing these things up is not just because they are incredibly cool, although they are, but because the specter of these industrial disputes really started to work its way into the conservative psyche and into the conservative movement as a kind of boogeyman. There is a lot of really compelling research that shows that Margaret Thatcher, who was elected conservative leader in 1975, was extremely unsettled and disquieted by the victory of the National Union of the Mine Workers and of Arthur Scargill during the Battle of Salt Lake Gate and during the 1972 UK miners' strike. And this led her to the creation of a report called Stepping Stones, which was about what they perceived as this vicious cycle where they believed that trade unions were exacerbating Britain's economic difficulties with unemployment and inflation through these industrial disputes. And this report became the basis of the labor policies of Thatcherism, which were successful in crushing many of the major institutions of the working class, including the National Union of Mine Workers, which had been so successful in the 70s, were defeated during the 1984-85 strike that happened, just over 10 years later. And this may seem to be a bit aside from the point of inflation, but I really think that the industrial disputes that were driven by inflation were extremely influential in the intellectual development of the anti-union policies, papers, and programs of these neoliberal parties.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize this connection between labor militancy and periods of high inflation, because historically these tended to correlate pretty closely. So getting a little outside of the sort of historical trajectory of our episode, if you look at periods after the First World War and the Second World War, as we mentioned, war economies often have very high inflation. The periods right after both of these wars were periods marked by huge levels of labor militancy, particularly after the First World War, where you have a kind of essentially a revolutionary wave that brings the war to an end. And this is because of the really tight labor market and high levels of mobilization of industrial production during the war, which meant that prices got very inflated while people's wages essentially flatlined, usually because of government regulation to try and constrain wages. In the Second World War, governments were more cognizant of that issue that happened in World War I and the sort of social unrest it would create, and did a better job rationing and controlling wages and prices to avoid this. But there were still large amounts of strikes in the developed West during the war, and a very large spike in strikes right after the war. So this connection between labor militancy and inflation is part of why the strategy to defeat inflation is so connected with anti-labor reforms and legislation and tactics, because defeating inflation is seen as a way to defeat the potential threat of labor as a political force. And that's why this sort of continues to this day.
Whether this strategy of squashing labor actually worked in taming inflation, or if it just kind of went away on its own, is still debated by scholars. And I think this says something about economics in general, but that's for another time. But there's surprisingly big cleavages over the question of how much wage growth contributes to inflation. And it seems, from my perspective at least, that it's used in a political way rather than an actual reality. But since wage growth has been pretty stagnant since the 1980s, we should be pretty suspicious of any current claims that inflation is the result of workers earning too much or governments overspending on social programs. For example, Conservative MP and finance critic Pierre Poilievre has been a tireless opponent of Justin Trudeau's, quote, coin-clipping inflationary policies, attempting to draw a threatening parallel between slightly more generous social spending and the bloated, declining Roman Empire, as if our current state of affairs has any reality or any connection to that empire. So let's return then to the present and what this uptick in inflation might mean for Canadian workers. We've pointed out already that inflation is bad when wages lag, and the low inflation rates of past decades meant that real wages only stagnated rather than declining. So wages sort of kept up with it, with inflation, rather than being pushed back. But now that we're seeing inflation accelerating again, the main solution that's being peddled is to reduce wages further. Besides the real pain that would inflict on workers, It would hobble future capitalist growth by undermining consumer spending as households cut expenses. This is part of the economy I've never really understood, that if we base our whole economy around consumer spending, it seems silly to not give consumers money to spend in the economy. But what do I know? I'm just a lowly historian, not an economist.
The other issue, too, is that this probably isn't going to work, this being reducing wages further, because the prices that we're seeing in the capitalist economy, for the most part, reflect exogenous crisis brought on by things like COVID-19 and the climate crisis. So this is things like Vancouver being cut off from the rest of Canada, and its port being cut off from the rest of Canada due to floods brought on by the climate crisis in late 2021. It's also worth pointing out that when businesses complain about there being a labor shortage, it is always, always, always about how they are loath to increase wages to attract workers. If a business is complaining that there is a labor shortage, this is always a way to discipline labor. This includes when businesses talk about a skilled labor shortage, not real. It is always about how their unwillingness to increase wages or problematic working conditions in the firm or in the industry.
I think it's also really important to understand how the pandemic has sort of played into all of this, and how we can now see inflation evolving in different ways. Because, the reality of the past 2.5 years or so is that we're really seeing profits of these corporations skyrocket, while labor is slightly increasing its wage demands, but it's really the profits that are creating the inflationary period we're seeing right now. By the end of 2021, U.S. corporate profits were up 37% over the year before, almost 40% in a year, while compensation only jumped 12%. And yet in the media, we hear all the time about how labor costs are driving up the prices of all our goods. So we get that rhetoric all the time of, if we pay a McDonald's worker minimum wage, a decent wage, your Big Mac's going to cost $20. But nobody ever asks whether the profits of McDonald's might come down in this process as well. While inflation has hit input costs, many businesses have used it as an opportunity to raise prices over inflation to capture higher profits. American meat producer Tyson Foods saw grain prices increase, for example, but then they translated that into a 42% increase in profits. Where possible, companies try to blame workers for these increases in prices so that consumers don't think it's just going to line the pockets of owners. A strike at the Cargill beef plant in High River was narrowly averted in December of 2021, for example. Workers wanted better protection against COVID, which had already killed 3 of them, rather than a big wage increase per se. But Cargill's concentration of 40% of Canada's beef processing has been incredibly profitable. And it made its prices susceptible to plant disruptions such as a strike. Stretched consumers would have been encouraged to blame the workers for these high meat prices rather than the profits of Cargill. And I think we saw this in the lead up to the kind of strike deadline. Our newspaper reports talking about these outrageous demands of the workers rather than the outrageous profit levels of Cargill.
Sometimes I like to punish myself and read the comments under Calgary Herald stories. So I read the comments. Yeah, exactly. I don't know why. But sometimes I just really feel the itch. So I read the comments under stories related to the potential of this strike at Cargill. And it's just incredible. All the people, the people who've just been turned into hardened reactionaries, just posting in there in the middle of the day saying if my cheeseburger goes up at all, we need to call on the Mounties to crush these people who have raised my prices. And just all of the people who put the price of, in some senses, expensive beef, or not even expensive beef. In some senses, meat can be thought of it in terms of luxury terms, or at least very cheap meat, and they're willing to put it on top of anyone's interest in not dying at work. And it's not that people who work in meat processing plants are particularly well paid, and many of them are often immigrants and don't have Canadian
They're actually
citizenship.
extremely poorly paid.
Yeah, they're highly exploited and have very little legal tenure in Canada, and that's intentional. And this is like what a lot of, this is what basically their entire like food system is built on, because you think of people who pick vegetables, they're almost always like immigrant labor that's highly exploited and lowly paid. And all these different things about it is like the fact that like in some sense it's like food is cheap. The historical reason why prices have been like stable and low for so long in food is because of like these high levels of labor exploitation. And what's happening with COVID is not so much that workers are standing up and demanding more. It's rather that they're just getting sick and unable to work. And the whole like supply chain begins to break down and causes all these like stacking delays. And that's sort of what COVID-19 has like really shown us about how inflation can be a product of these supply chain shocks to that the sort of global logistics network is very vulnerable to. So the idea that we need to squash wages further and attack workers because they're the cause of inflation is not even going to really work to deal with inflation, because they're already very poorly paid. And the issue isn't that they want more, it's rather that there's something else that's causing this. And that's sort of why we have to like really think about what climate change is going to do.
I also think it's important to look at the Alberta context, where workers are not winning wages that are keeping up with inflation at all. So the civil service recently ratified their contract with the government of Alberta. And in that contract, they took several years of zeros, as the contract had been expired for multiple years, and then a 1.25% salary increase for January 1st, 2023, and then a 1.5% salary increase for September 1st, 2023, with a potential for an additional 0.5% increase based on economic factors. So this is absolutely on no planet a collective agreement that is keeping up with inflation. And this was the deal signed by AUPE, which represents civil service workers working for the government of Alberta. And this is the contract in Alberta that tends to set the standard for other public sector contract negotiations that happen in Alberta. In addition to the collective agreement that AUP ratified, the United Nurses of Alberta has recently recommended the mediators report to their members, which in the Alberta labor movement means there is a very, very excellent chance that this new collective agreement will be ratified by the members of the United Nurses of Alberta, which represents registered nurses here in Alberta. And this recommendation included pay increases over the life of a 4-year collective agreement amounting to 4.25%. In addition, a one-time lump sum payment of 1% for 2021. So this is looking at very similar to the contract that AUPE signed, with these 1% increases per year. Again, definitely not keeping up with inflation. So I think it's important when we look at the Alberta landscape to look at these large public sector union contracts, not only because they represent a large amount of workers, but because these large public sector contracts do often drive the wages that other unionized workers receive, and also that other non-unionized workers receive, just because they're very large employers that employ so many people and tend to do a lot of standard setting for the wages of Albertan workers, whether in the public or the private sector, union or non-union.
Well, and I think it's worth, emphasizing this point that, the amount that these unions have agreed to or about to agree to is much better than what the government was originally offering, which was minus wage increases, or I guess wage decreases in that sense, but still nowhere even close to the inflation. And we have to keep in mind that these unions haven't had raises in, I'm not sure what theirs are. My union, it's been over a decade since we've had a raise. And so this is culminating over and over and over into a decreased purchasing power for all of these workers. And we're talking here about public sector workers, which, are unionized. They tend to have good representation, good power within the system relative to, of course, all sorts of things. And so we should really be, paying a lot of attention to the non-unionized workers and the others who are even struggling even more to keep up with these with these price increases. Their wages for decades now haven't been keeping up with these price increases, and it's really affecting a lot of people. But instead of looking at these exorbitant profits that these corporations are making. Instead, the blame again is being put on wage increases and the labor unions and their bosses, their union bosses, for demanding all of this high compensation.
I do feel like I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the strategy which the government pursued in collective bargaining of offering these terrible wage rollbacks and then being like, actually, we'll give you a measly 1% is a pretty classic bargaining tactic that employers like to use to make things like wage freezes or wage increases that don't keep up with inflation seem better. If someone offers you that right off the bat, you're more likely to say no than if someone says, I'm going to take away, 4% is 2 weeks of work for a lot of people. So it feels a lot better to have none of your wages taken away once someone has dangled taking 4% of the money you make every year away. I also think going forward that COVID-19 has really shown that inflation is largely a product of a global supply chain that is very, very vulnerable to shocks. And this is a supply chain that is really dependent on very high levels of labor exploitation all over the world, but particularly in the global south. And when enough workers are sick or not working, delays really quickly pile up and prices surge. And companies are perfectly willing to take advantage where they can and blame someone else, usually labor. And I think grocery stores, which we've mentioned earlier, are a really great example of this, where yes, they are seeing the prices of raw inputs increase, but they are translating that into massive, massive increases in profits, which are on no planet and in no reality being matched by increases in their workers' wages.
Yeah, and I don't think it can be stressed enough. Like, one of the things about inflation is that it is a kind of stealth pay cut. And when it happens, what's interesting is conservative messaging around inflation is they say it's a stealth tax, but it's not the government collecting the sort of lost wages that inflation causes. It's just actually business that captures it as profit. And so that's like why the Kenney government never actually cut the minimum wage, despite there was a lot of businesses that wanted that to happen. The Kenney government would just let inflation do its work. So the minimum wage was raised to $15 in 2018, and there has not been an increase since. Because if we assume the Kenney government gets booted out in 2023 and Rachel Notley's NDP comes back and decides to start raising
generous
the minimum wage
assumptions.
again, yeah, generous assumptions. That means that there was 4 years of no wage increases for everyone who was earning minimum wage, which is hundreds of thousands of Albertans. And the thing about like wages and inflation and climate change is that climate change, like COVID-19, is just going to be basically make everything worse. Like last year's heat dome, the forest fires, the BC floods, these are just but a taste of the havoc climate change will wreak on supply chains. And in terms of things like these heat domes can like just fry crops and droughts and all these like wacky things like will make like basic food staples more expensive. And if your wages aren't going up, the sort of price inflation or what we call the sort of cost push inflation of supply shortages are going to mean that your standard of living is going to like really erode as a result of climate change in kind of like very financial ways. Because like very often when people think about what climate change will have an impact on your life is like you're going to have to, people think about like, oh, well, I'm going to have to live through these sort of climate disasters like floods and heat waves and forest fires. That's absolutely stuff that's going to happen to you. But a lot of it is just going to be watching year over year your standard of living erode because of the impacts that climate change has on the capitalist supply chain and the price increases it causes and your inability to see your wages rise or keep up with that. So you'll just simply be able to like buy less and less of these things, not necessarily because there is less of them, but because you just can't afford it.
Well, one of the funny things I find going back to the minimum wage conversation, which I think connects into this is that, you know, there's been this fight for 15 going on for I guess, you know, basically decades now, that as they're starting to win the fight for 15, $15 an hour is basically meaningless. There's all these studies. You can find them all over the place of what it costs to live in the major cities of Canada, the United States, and elsewhere. And, $15 an hour ain't going to cut it in any of those places. And this is getting worse and worse and worse. We mentioned earlier the housing crisis. This is a huge problem that we're going to face going forward in terms of inflation and its effects on working people. And I think the minimum wage is also part of that, we're really seeing this, pace of inflation outstrip even our minimum demands for change. And climate change is just going to exacerbate all of these problems. And unless we start dealing with the profit side of the equation, I'm not sure how we solve the pressure on average working Canadians and others, let alone, people in developing countries in the global south and elsewhere. This is going to be a massive problem that's just going to keep going further and further down a rabbit hole of pain and punishment and exploitation.
Yes, I hope everyone has enjoyed living in permanent crisis for the past 2 years, going into year 3 of permanent crisis, and probably the rest of your life. Personally, I don't like it and am having a really bad time, but I'm sure someone is really enjoying themselves and or making a ton of money off of it, so probably it's all worth it in the end.
I mean, yeah, corporate profits are at record levels.
Oh, well, that makes it all worth it then. On a slightly less glib note, assuming business as usual, we definitely should expect permanent crisis pricing inflation as consumers. And I do want to say here is that absolutely, especially in the global north, there are external costs of cheap consumer goods that are not represented in the prices of the items we buy. So that's things like the exploitation of land in the global south, the exploitation of workers in the global south, pollution caused by extremely disastrous supply chains. A whole variety of things go into me being able to buy a notebook or an iPad or a cheap 6-pack of glasses from IKEA. But I also think it's really important to keep in mind that, yes, there are external costs to cheap consumer goods, but they do all exist in a system where all of these cheap consumer goods are being produced for profit rather than end user luxury or even really end user use value. And I think at the very least, we should be demanding that stable prices are the norm for basics. And of course, better yet, that these types of basics are entirely decommodified. And that would require a society that does not allocate goods and resources based on the market, but instead plans what we do with goods, what we do with resources, what we do with labor. And that, my friends, is a communist society.
Related to that, like one of the things we've kind of harped on a fair bit has been inflation in the prices of meat. Like the amount of meat that we eat is like almost certainly like not environmentally sustainable. The price, like even the inflation to the price that we've seen, like does not actually reflect that, like the externalities it's created. And that's like very important to think about how these like cheap consumer goods and it's very important to think about how these cheap consumer goods and the externalities of their pricing like affects like what we think about as inflation, because like and particularly because this is like how like so deeply related to like profit accumulation, because producing like cheap meat and ignoring all of the externalities of it is like very, very profitable. And the way that companies have like to an extent like externalized like some of the costs that it has generated like around climate change and its and the sort of disruptions it caused to the supply chain for this. They've used it mostly as an excuse to increase our prices. But this is not really about how the elites are going to make us all eat bugs instead of like delicious cheeseburgers. It's going to be about how they're going to use like inflation as a way to
price us out is basically what it seems to me. Like we're going to be forced to eat bugs because we can't afford meat before we're forced to eat bugs because environmental issues demand it.
Well, no, I don't think we're going to be forced to eat bugs. It's just we're going to keep externalizing the cost onto somebody else.
Yes, there's going to be constant externalization of cost. And I think there can be a temptation to have this moralizing impulse when it comes to looking at inflation and being like, well, people shouldn't be buying cars or eating meat because they are destroying the planet, or because, the lithium mining involved in your computer is destroying South America. But the reason that the prices of these things are going up with inflation is not because they're accurately reflecting in any way the labor or the resources or the externalities caused by manufacturing these goods, getting them to you, etc. It's caused by some of the many things we discussed earlier that are causes of inflation. And then it is being exploited by capitalists and by capitalist firms in order to further repress labor and drive down wages, which should be of a concern to anyone.
I think this is what makes capitalism so confusing to me. I mean, there's lots of things that make it so confusing to me, like why the hell do we do it? But aside from that, I mean, it's really confusing to me that we have this system where we just keep externalizing these costs and these prices. And basically somebody just makes up a reason why it's not working. And we're told constantly that, the market will decide the cost and the price, and the market will determine X, Y, and Z. And it just seems to me that very, very little of what happens in this system is market driven at all. And in fact, it's all about corporate leaders, corporate owners, basically, making a system that works for them. Now, none of this is, of course, shocking at all, but it seems to me that inflation is a really good example of how we see this play out, where, inflation is real. It's a reality of growth. We've talked about some of the reasons why it might happen, but the blame is always being put on wage increases and on, the working class, rather than on the system itself and on, the high profits that are being raked in. And so, it seems to me if we were going to have a system based on the market and actual supply and demand and all the crap that they teach you in economics 100, it seems to me that none of this actually works with what they're telling me.
Yeah, inflation is or at least the way that we're dealing with inflation now is a very great example of how capitalism is very good at displacing crises, where this inflation is an issue that has to be dealt with because it can become a threat to capitalist accumulation. But then there are many different options how it can be kind of solved, at least for the moment. And part of it has been suppressing wage demands as a way of keeping prices down. And this creates sort of a new, from the 1970s, created a new kind of social contract where you would have access to all these cheap consumer goods, even if you didn't necessarily have growing wages, or even were producing the sorts of goods you bought. But at some point, the consumers in the developed North are buying a lot of these consumer goods on credit rather than through higher wages that they've earned. So then this just creates another crisis that you saw in 2008. And now again, we have this issue, how I think there's a very big political question about how voters in the global North will deal with these kinds of rising prices as they become more and more inevitable. As we've said, part of that is because companies are just looking to increase their profit margins. Part of it is because of actual externalities that are kind of coming back into the pricing equation. And the question is will voters in the global North think about how we can build a better, fairer society that actually takes into account inflation, and how inflation or these sorts of externalities should be priced in a fair way? Or are we just going to vote to try and have the crisis displaced onto somebody else, usually via imperialism? And folks, the history of it is not necessarily the most encouraging.
Yeah, I was going to say, what do we think is going to happen?
I think fascism. It seems to be the common one, right?
I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to be defeatist or unnecessarily pessimistic on this podcast, but I do think it can be really tempting in a situation where we're seeing an obvious crisis of capitalism and an obvious contradiction of capitalism, like inflation, to think, oh, surely this must be the contradiction that reveals to people that capitalism is a system of organizing our society that is bad for the planet, bad for us, and we should create a different system. But but there's not actually any historical evidence that that is going to magically happen. And capitalism is incredibly, incredibly good at resolving these contradictions through violence, through imperialism, through the destruction of land, through the destruction of people. So I think that we should definitely not think that anytime there is a crisis or a contradiction in capitalism, that it is going to intrinsically or necessarily lead people to more radical beliefs, when capitalism has historically shown an incredibly remarkable capacity for resolving these contradictions and being able to self-perpetuate itself. In conclusion,
that's a happy note. Yeah, that's a happy note to conclude on. But I think it's important
it's
to
not
recognize
inevitable.
these
It's just
things.
our enemies are really powerful.
They are
Yeah.
incredibly powerful. And I think the importance of doing an episode like this is for people to then be able to be critical of the rhetoric around these issues, to be able to say like, oh, wait, you're raising this issue of inflation, but for what purpose? Is it really to help me as a working class? I mean, I'm not a working class person, but is it to help me as an average Canadian? Or is it to help businesses make more profit? And, you know, the elites are going to try and push us down a path towards fascism and towards an easy solution to capitalism. And, you know, our responsibility in the dying days of this apocalypse are to fight back as much as humanly possible and to raise these issues. And so, you know, it's hard not to end every conversation in 2022 on a doom and gloom. I guess my answer is I'm just going to keep fighting until the day I die. But it's really kind of where we're at.
In conclusion, we hope this episode has been a useful historical and contemporary primer on the topic of inflation, which we believe you are only going to hear more about as this year goes on. And the main takeaway that the three of us hope that you have from this episode is that when you hear people talk about inflation and you hear people talk about the specific ways in which they want to solve inflation, we encourage you to ask, to whose benefit is inflation, and to whose benefit is the specific way people are talking about solving this problem of inflation? It is, generally speaking, a very good question to ask in capitalist countries when you are looking at the way our society is organized and the solutions people are posing to problems in our society, but it is an especially good one when you are looking at issues of inflation. On behalf of everyone here at the Alberta Advantage, stay safe out there and take care. Goodbye, everyone. Bye.